You're listening to episode 318 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Robert M. Ellis returns to the podcast to speak about his new book, The Buddha's Middle Way, Experiential Judgement in His Life and Teaching. Hi, everyone. Before we begin today's episode, I'd like to mention that this podcast and the supporting website, discussion forums, our live online practice circle, and other services provided by the Secular Buddhist Association are supported by you. If you find this episode or any of our other offerings helpful to you in some way, I ask that you take a moment and visit secularbuddhism.org and click on the contributions button. There are many ways you can help, which are listed on that page. And if you make a donation, it's tax deductible and helps ensure the SBA is able to continue the exploration of secular Buddhism. Thank you. We're glad to have you join us on the conversation. The Buddha's guidance was clear. Avoid extremes, live a life of balance in the middle way. In the complexities of life, though, rests a question about how to find that path. What might the Buddhasasana have to say about discerning that road and how to take it? He has been developing middle way philosophy since 1997, initially from a PhD thesis, and has published a number of books on the subject, including the 4-volume Middle Way Philosophy series, the introductory book Miglism, The Christian Middle Way, and the Buddha's Middle Way. He was formerly a member of the Tiratana Buddhist order, but is no longer committed to any one religious tradition, though inspired by elements of both Buddhism and Christianity. Philosophy, critical thinking, psychology, politics, and the arts are also very important to him. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice middle tea. Our guest today returning to the podcast is Robert M. Ellis. Robert, welcome back. Good to see you again.
Thank you very much, Ted. It's great to be back.
So before we go on to what we're here to talk about with your new book, I do want to catch up the listeners who may recall our conversations about Middle Way, the Middle Way Society. Maybe you can say a bit about that because it has grown a great deal over the past few years.
Okay, well, the Middle Way Society, it's been going since 2013, really. It is international, at least in theory, but although it's pretty UK-based in practice when we actually meet each other at the moment. But the Middle Way Society focuses on the middle way as a universal principle. So although probably the majority of us have come out of some sort of Buddhist background of some kind, though not all by any means, we are approaching the middle way really as a principle of judgment rather than something that's culturally or traditionally Buddhist or subject to the authority of Buddhist tradition sense. So that means that we can draw on all sorts of sources of inspiration and practice. And obviously that includes all sorts of influences from Western psychology and philosophy, and also potentially other religious traditions where relevant. I mean, one of our leading members is a rabbi, so we do have other kinds of traditional influences. So we are both a practice and a theory society. We're trying to bring them both together because there's a lot of, I think, unexamined, undeveloped theory in relation to so that's particularly what I've been interested in because I'm a bit of a theoretician, but the society is just as much about practice to support people in the practice of the middle way, which can involve a wide range of practices, but with a sense of what that practice is for. So it's a community of people who are helping to develop the middle way as a universal principle and practice.
One of the things I'm curious about that as you were speaking is the idea of what we mean by a middle way and how different perspectives may fit into the mix. That for one person, the middle way may be kind of here on a spectrum, but for someone else, it's a little bit further at one end or the other. So I'm wondering how you work with that.
Well, by trying to be reasonably clear about what we mean by it, yes. So there are various misunderstandings that people quite readily get into. One of those is, there's some sort of moderation. And another, I think, is an over-rigid kind of attachment to a Buddhist formulation of it, which can, they can get bogged down in determinism and nihilism and what are they, and so on. But, the way I would formulate it generally is that the middle way is a principle of judgment that can be used in any context, which avoids the avoidance of either positive or negative absolutes. So those absolutes really are a matter of mental state. So it's a matter of whether you think you've got the whole story when you're making a judgment, whether you completely accept a particular set of assumptions, or whether you completely reject them, so as to narrow the range of what you consider, so as to narrow the options. And if you narrow the options too much when you're making a judgment, whether it's a trivial thing, like what to have for lunch, or whether it's something really important, like what job to take, or how to solve the climate crisis, whatever it is, you narrow the options too much, then you're less likely to address the conditions. So there's very likely to be things going on that you're not facing up to. So it's got a very wide applicability, but I do see a lot of connections, obviously, from the name, between that and the Buddha's middle way, which I see as the particular form that the middle way took in the Buddha's circumstances at Buddha's time. So rather than, as Buddhism has traditionally tended to do, taking the middle way specifically in the terms that it developed and was formulated in the Buddha's time, but then became fixed in the tradition, we try and go back to a more general universal formulation, of which the Buddhist version is an example.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I really like about the approach is it's not coming from a stance of this is an ideological certitude that we must adhere to, but rather here is, and you said that beautifully, an example of how this principle can manifest in the world.
Quite, and that's why it's very much about facing up to uncertainty and being provisional in our judgments. So obviously, the first thing you have to do if you're going to question an over-certainty, question the assumption that you've got the whole story at any point, whether positively or negatively, first thing you have to do is recognise that this is actually uncertain when you assume it is certain, whether that's religious or a scientific dogma, or it could be a view about yourself or a view about what the best way of practicing is. There's a whole possible huge range of possible dogmas or over-certitudes we could get into.
So how about the society itself? As I was looking at the website, I see that there's quite a lot there. I'm wondering if you might mention a few highlights that might be of interest to the listeners.
Okay, well, there's a variety of activities, certainly. A lot of them are web-based, just because we're quite spread out, but we also have retreats, which tend to take place, on average, about 3 times a year, something like that. but for practical reasons, they've had to be in the UK so far, so that's where people can actually meet. But the retreats cover slightly different themes, and what we try to do is to bring different kinds of practice together and show how they can relate to each other. So there's always an element of meditation on them, and there's nearly always some kind of artistic practical element, and there's always some kind of critical discussion relating to aspects of the middle way or its application. And then there's also free time, so making friends and going for walks and all the stuff that you do on retreat. So in some ways, people might recognise features of a traditional Buddhist retreat there, like the mindfulness and the spaciousness. And I've consciously taken some of those models from Buddhist retreats, but we also do. We try and make the range of practices wider and have a very clearly universal kind of framework, so that we're not just assuming, for example, that people want to bow in front of the Buddha or anything of that kind. So there's that. But then thinking about the wider society's activities, we have a podcast. So we've interviewed, I think it was Barry, who runs the podcast, and he's done about 150 of them so far during the last 6 years. And that's with quite a wide range of people whose work, whose practice or ideas or whatever it is, in some way illuminates the middle way or intersects with the middle way. Quite often it's psychologists and philosophers, but also practitioners of various kinds, and indeed ordinary members at times. So just people talking about how they have been able to use the middle way in some sense, some way. And then there are other things on our website. There are blogs, there are videos which I've created, which try to break down what the middle way might mean, particularly in relation to 5 principles of the middle way, which are an analysis of how it can work. So there were videos illustrating all that to try and make it more accessible. And then there are the books I've written, which have become part of the life of the society in some ways. And then there's our social media work, so we have a Facebook page and so on. So yeah, there's a variety of stuff from the intellectual to the practical, and from the very heavily web-based to the face-to-face stuff. But we're still quite a small outfit, really.
Yeah. But congratulations. It's difficult to keep this going, particularly with a distributed group that has so much that's based on the internet, to be going for as many years as you have been. And it's good to see that that's grown over time. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if you might shift direction a little bit to your new book, The Buddha's Middle Way, and I thought a very interesting experiential judgment in his life and teaching. And that really caught my interest. So I'm wondering if you might just say a little bit about what prompted you to write this book and what's it about.
Well, the emphasis of my writing for the last few years has been on trying to press that the middle way is a universal thing. So I haven't really been writing about Buddhism. This book marks a return to Buddhism, obviously. And what I think that's been actuated most by is the reflection that people need traditions, and people relate to things through traditions. And that's just a fact of how humans operate, that they need certain kinds of hooks and props. They need stories as well, particularly, as ways of engaging with things. So I wanted to put forward the case, really, that the middle way as a universal principle is there and can be found in the Buddha's life and teachings, and that there's a reasonable interpretation of it all, which is the universal middle way. So that simultaneously involves, I think, a positive exposition of where you can find the middle way in the Buddha's life and teachings. And also the second half of the book is more of a critical account of how Buddhism hasn't really always successfully transmitted that, and all kinds of other assumptions have got distorted our understanding of the middle way through the Buddhist tradition. So probably that means that the two halves of the book do have a slightly different emphasis and a different tone. The first half will be the more inspirational half, which I think most people will probably find easier to engage with. Second half is more intellectually demanding, but it does deal with a lot of issues. So the first part is concerned with the Buddha's life, particularly the life story, and it's a story before the Enlightenment. So one thing that also people might find new about the book is that it tries to basically remain agnostic about historical issues and not to appeal to history in any way, explicitly or implicitly, but at the same time to credit all the sources and to engage seriously with the Holy Canon, which my previous writings about Buddhism, to be honest, hadn't. So the trouble with Buddhism, which you interviewed me about, was it 5 years ago or something, was quite a bright, popular book, just making a case, but he didn't engage with the Holy Canon very much at all. This book does, and I have found that it is quite possible to be kind of serious in your engagement with the tradition without doing it on its terms. That's what I've been trying to do. If you think about, say, the traditional story of the Buddha leaving the palace and going into the forest, going forth and then engaging with his teachers, Alara Kalama and Duda Karalaputta, and then with the 5 ascetics. So hopefully this story will be familiar to many of your listeners. Then, having tried these two extremes, these two approaches, neither of which fully worked for him, then discovering the middle way. So that's the kind of dialectical structure which I'm concerned with. So trying one thing and trying the opposite, neither of them quite working, and then trying a third option in between. So in both cases, those extremes, the palace and the forest, represent absolute ways of thinking. So in the palace, the Buddha is, or Buddha to be, is in a very conventional environment with a lot of worldly demands being made on him. He's got to fulfill a particular role. He's got a kind of caste duty as being in the Buddha's ruling family. And probably know the story, he sees all the limitations of that and goes forth from it. But then he encounters, instead of that, religious dogma, religious limitations. So he learns a lot from the two teachers that he has, but they don't take him quite where he wants to get to. So he recognizes the limitations in what they have to offer. So just as he didn't have to totally reject the palace in the end, he didn't have to totally reject his teachers, he could adopt some features of what they had to offer, but he couldn't take them to be the whole story. And the same applied to the asceticism, which is also part of the forest story, where he tried gaining merit, working towards enlightenment as he believed it to be, through austerities. And that didn't work either. So that was the immediate reason for him discovering the middle way, according to traditional accounts. And when he did that, it's quite striking that a memory came back to him of meditating under the rose apple tree. So it was quite an embodied experience, perhaps an experience of jhana, of meditative absorption, of being one with his body, inhabiting his body fully, that brought him back to the middle way. So that provided an alternative to the highly absolutized, abstracted assumptions that were motivating those two high-pressure groups which he'd learnt from and avoided on either side. So in the middle way, he realized they're offering him something, but none of them could be taken to be the whole story, and he had to find his own way forward from that point, which combined some of what he could learn from those two extreme groups. So that's basically a model, I think, of how we can move forward whenever we encounter conflict in whatever context. So that could be, obviously, a conflict between two groups in society, could be within ourselves.
Yeah, and I like the way you articulate this as a discovery of the middle way. Like quite often there's something I've encountered a great deal lately, and you and I've been involved in conversations online where there seems to be a sense of ownership. of human capabilities, human experience, whether it's from a Buddhist perspective, Buddhist values, or I often have pushed back on Christian values. I'm like, how about just values? And why do they need to be owned by any one group? And the way you've blended this, and it sounds like you have put it in the book as well, and certainly in our conversations over the past few years, is that these are human capabilities, and they're not really the exclusive purview of one ideological view or religious view or stance or practice.
Indeed. Yeah. So they come out of the conditions in which humans work. And there's a lot more you could say about why that's the case, of course, but about the psychology of it and possibly the neuroscience of that. But probably enough to say at the moment that there is a case to be made for a great many different connections from different ways that the human condition has been investigated philosophically and psychologically and neuroscientifically, and indeed linguistically and sociologically. All these different ways of understanding the human condition. You can find elements of all of those, but point towards these problematic absolute views that we can fall into, and the way in which they are in polarized opposition to each other, and of how we can address conditions more effectively by avoiding those extremes in a conscious way.
So I'm wondering if you might say a bit more about the second part of the book.
Well, that's the critical part as far as the Buddhist tradition is concerned. What I do there is, there's one section which deconstructs many of the elements of the traditional Buddhist interpretation of the Middle Way. There's also a discussion of the Noble Eightfold Path and of a number of other Buddhist teachings, and of how they might look if you chose to interpret them with the Middle Way put first. So given priority, rather than taking some other priority of the Buddhist tradition first to interpret the Middle Way, if you take the Middle Way first. And indeed, it was the first thing the Buddha mentioned in his first sermon, which may not be a coincidence. So if you want me to say a little bit about would you like me to go into a bit more about the issues with the traditional Buddhist account of the Middle Way?
Yeah, I think that would be a really good thing for us to dive into a little bit, particularly for the listeners of this podcast.
Well, there's a number of things to say about it, but there's a set of assumptions about skepticism is one thing I discuss. There are what I call the ontological obsession, which is the obsession that you find both in Buddhism and in much Western discussion with how things are rather than how we should judge them. That's a very basic kind of philosophical issue involved here. And then there's slightly more specific stuff about eternalism and nihilism and how that's a specific product of the conditions in which the Buddha lived. And also the priority, which in traditional Buddhism, it's not an even-handed middle way between eternalism and nihilism. Eternalism is given second place and nihilism third place in priority. And again, I try and examine the reasons why that might be, and I put forward an argument that actually we need to be even-handed in our treatment of the middle way, and that's pretty central to what the middle way means in experiential practice, as opposed to the theories that are developed in Buddhism. So that's kind of four areas, if you like, which I could go into any of those a bit more if you'd like me to.
Pick your favorite. The one that you're most excited about. Let's talk about that.
Okay. Let's talk about skepticism then, because I think that's also one of the issues that's quite come up when I've had discussions on the Secular Buddhist website and so on over the years. It's one of the things that's come up most often. So, question of how you interpret skepticism. So the term skepticism has been used, it's been picked up in recent times, I think, by people who prefer a more secular or scientific view of things, and they use that as a kind of rallying point. They refer to themselves as skeptics, often with a K, the American spelling. But the earlier sense of skeptic goes back to the ancient Greeks, to the Pyrrhonists particularly, and was very clearly even-handed in a way in which I don't always find the modern skeptics to be. So That by even-handedness here, I mean avoiding both positive and negative absolutes, one kind or another. So I see there to be a close relationship between the middle way and skepticism, each implying the other, because skepticism is just recognizing our uncertainty, the uncertainty that follows from us being embodied human creatures with limited knowledge, limited capabilities to understand what's going on. So if we're in a state of uncertainty, that means we neither know positively how things really are or negatively how things are not. So there should be just as much weight on not accepting negative claims, absolute negative claims, as on absolute positive ones. But it's very, very easy in reaction against a positive traditional claim, like, for example, the dogmas of Christianity, to immediately go to the opposite set of claims. And that obviously leads to a set of polarities which you can find in philosophical discussions of, for example, theism and atheism, free will determinism, idealism, realism. There's a whole set of pairs, and people who've rejected one of those, perhaps because they find it in their own cultural set of dogmas, if you like, can rapidly go to the opposite extreme. I think if we're going to find a universal middle way, we need to find that middle, which is a consistently skeptical middle. It's also an agnostic middle in the sense that you're deliberately not accepting a belief or knowledge of either of those two extremes.
In fact, one thing I'd like to add in this, which I think is complementary to what you're saying, is there's often an implication or I would say a misperception of skepticism as being a denialism.
That's right. Yeah.
The way that I view, and I believe you do as well, skepticism, and many who are involved in contemporary skepticism, is that it's a questioning. How do I know this, whatever this is, to be so, as best we can, knowing that certainty is not necessarily going to be found.
Yeah.
And that I have seen in skeptic groups that I've been involved with for a long time, that it goes to a point of ideological attachment to such a degree that evidence, which skeptics should find an important part of the discernment in topics, to be ignored because it is in conflict with an ideal of what they have in their heads. So I just want to share that with the audience, that there is, as you've said, a continuing questioning. And how do I know this to be so?
Yeah, exactly. But so much is the habit of considering it to be something negative and based in denial. I think we find this actually not only in the Western tradition, but also in the Buddhist tradition. So that, we don't have much material on this, but the treatment of skeptical thinkers in the Buddha's time seems to be similar. There's these very subtle distinctions between what the Buddha's saying and what the skeptics in the Buddha's time are saying. I'm not really convinced that there was necessarily any real difference, just that ideologically it's been separated in some sense.
Right. The difference I seem to land on as nihilists are described is refusing to accept any concept at all, which seems kind of an extreme, about cause and effect, that there's no link, and that's just such a ridiculous concept, so easily debunked of, if I hold an object and I let it go, it will drop. That is just a real world experiential example of cause and effect.
Yes, the issues become basically linguistic about how you describe these things. So as soon as you start describing it ontologically as this is how things are, there's this danger, and it all depends on how you interpret it, but it's this danger that you get attached to it and that you treat it as a final explanation. But that's one of the principles that I emphasize a lot and also talk about in the book as an implication of the middle way and of skepticism is provisionality, that we adopt a position, and if it's a provisional positive adoption of a position, then we are still capable of considering alternatives. We haven't assumed it to be the whole story. And again, I think provisionality is something that people sometimes sort of take for granted. They sort of assume, perhaps because they're drawing on science in some way, that their position must be provisional. But for it actually to be provisional, they've got to be able to consider alternative options when they're considering. So it's a psychological criterion, I think, we need to use for what is provisional and what is not, rather than just a kind of formal one.
And I think that these principles you're describing in Middle Way of, let's say there's a commonly held understanding, a provisional acceptance of something. If a different and contrary, in some fashion, idea is introduced, I think the appropriate thing to do from a Middle Way standpoint, from a skeptical standpoint, is to ask, that's very interesting. Show me, how do you know this to be so, or what is it that makes this seem to be a valid point of view?
Yeah, so you can only continue to examine in that way if you're open to other options, to considering other options and to finding other options meaningful, which in turn depends on your habitual mental states. So that's where I'd see there as being a relationship between provisionality and integration. So how far we've actually habitually overcome our conflicts to the extent where we're not automatically absolutizing, automatically dismissing alternatives.
So I'm curious what you're hoping people who read through the book, what are you hoping they'll get out of it? Are there some ideas that you're really hoping will set with people?
I think people could get various things out of it because, as I've mentioned, there's a bit of a difference between the first half and the second half. So I suspect some people will read the first half and I hope will at least be inspired by the first half towards some positive connection with the Middle Way, and it being something that they can find inspiration for in the Buddhist tradition if they're already into Buddhism, and then hopefully practice. So that's the basic thing I hope lots of people get out of it. There's then a slightly more demanding thing I hope some other people will get out of it, which is to go into that intellectual case and understand it better. That there is, well, a way of understanding, or a potential way of understanding Buddhism, which is, it's distinct from the traditional dogmas which have been often justified through some sort of absolute appeal to something in the scriptures or something, stuff of claim that's being made, which usually comes back to the idea of enlightenment as a kind of revelatory source of information, and that Buddhism can be understood and interpreted in this way, which puts the Middle Way first rather than in a revelatory way. And that also involves avoiding the negative extreme, the negative absolutization, so it avoids dismissing it, or indeed dismissing Buddhist tradition, in that provides a way for people to, or a pretext for people to investigate it more closely for its practical value.
Yeah, and also working with one's own confirmation bias. I often see, for example, I think the way you brought this up was really quite eloquent in, let's say there is an idea of enlightenment, what that means, what it is, in ways that might be difficult to discern, put it that way, and looking for facts that fit the case rather than looking at what are the circumstances. How do we know this to be so? And is it also valid to question, how can I know that someone's internal experience or recollection is a truism, for want of a better word, in the world, when it may or may not be? And how do we determine that?
Yeah, well, that's part of the difficulty in using enlightenment as a sort of departure point in Buddhism, as it so often is, that we're supposedly talking about somebody's particular state, that's a state that's only really understood by them, and yet we're deriving all these claims from it, which are supposed to apply to us in our situation, very often with quite insufficient recognition of how much that changes things. It's a different situation from the one that the Buddha was in.
So, Robert, is there anything else you'd like to share with the listeners before I let you go?
Well, I haven't really mentioned, in relation to the book, I haven't really mentioned the last section, which connects the material about the Buddhist tradition and the Buddha with other ways of understanding the middle way. I mean, it's relatively brief for space reasons, but there are 10 different approaches discussed there to the middle way. So there's, for example, there's aspects of the middle way in Christianity, there's Pyrrhonism, there's a discussion of brain lateralization, the work of Ian McGilchrist, there's work talk about cognitive psychology and embodied meaning and so on. Yeah, so there are a number of different other routes there. And what I'm hoping people might get out of that particularly is just to recognize that there are so many other different ways you can approach this and different forms of inspiration you can get for practicing the middle way. And so even if you're attracted to free Buddhism initially, it could take you to lots of other places.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, is that, again, with having this open and accessible to those who may not be Buddhist, that might not be the framework that they're entering the conversation with, this is still something that, as a human being, can really be helpful to them in their lives. Thank you for those who are listening. You can find out more on the episode page for this episode. We'll have a couple of links there, including to the book and our guest today, Robert M. Ellis. Robert, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Ted.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.